Gabriel Rossi ran the city's underworld with an iron grip, a loaded Glock, and a completely empty stomach. He survived on black coffee, adrenaline, and casual violence. To him, lunch was a weakness, a 30-minute window where a man could be shot, indicted, or overthrown. Until Audrey Miller, his chronically underpaid secretary, got tired of his low blood sugar tantrums. She didn't care about his body count. She just wanted him to sign the shipping manifests without throwing a stapler. So she brought a Tupperware container into the lion's den. The air in the corner office always smelled of ozone, expensive espresso, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood that never quite washed out of Gabriel's custom wool suits. Gabriel Rossi did not stop. He didn't know how. At 34, he was the head of a syndicate that controlled every shipping container moving through the port of Boston. He was a man who lived his life in 15-minute increments, scheduled tightly between legitimate board meetings and illegitimate beatdowns. He arrived at 6 in the morning. He left at midnight, and he never, ever ate lunch. Audrey Miller noticed it on her third day. Audrey wasn't part of the life. She was a 27-year-old woman with a master's degree in accounting, a mountain of student debt, and a severely pragmatic streak. She had applied for the executive assistant position at Rossi Logistics because the salary was double the market rate and the medical benefits covered her mother's expensive asthma medications. She knew who Gabriel Rossi was. Everyone in Boston knew. But rent was due, and morality didn't pay the heating bill. Her desk sat just outside his frosted glass door, a gatekeeper's station. From there, she watched the Daily Theatre. At exactly 12:30 p.m., a terrified junior associate from a high-end restaurant would arrive. Sometimes it was seared scallops. Sometimes it was Wagyu steak. The associate would leave the silver-domed tray on Audrey's desk and practically run to the elevator. Audrey would carry it in. Gabriel would wave her away without looking up from his mahogany desk. "Leave it," he would say. His voice was gravel and smoke, always rough, always impatient. She would leave it on the side table. At 3:00 p.m., she would carry it back out. Cold, untouched, the fat on the steak congealed, the scallops rubbery. By 4 p.m., Gabriel would become impossible. It wasn't a loud, theatrical rage. It was a cold, snapping viciousness. His jaw would lock. A muscle would tick just beneath his right eye. He would tear into his lieutenants, men with broken noses and cauliflower ears, until they walked out of his office pale and sweating. He would reject contracts, snap at Audrey for using the wrong color paperclips, and stare out the floor-to-ceiling windows with a rigid, terrifying stillness. He was starving, and his hunger was making everyone's life hell. "He's going to kill someone," Dominic, Gabriel's underboss, muttered one Thursday. Dominic was a massive man who wore suits 3 sizes too small. He was currently rubbing the bridge of his nose, having just survived a 20-minute dressing down regarding a late shipment of stolen electronics. "I swear to God, Audrey, he's losing his mind." "He's losing his glucose," Audrey replied, not looking up from her spreadsheet. Her keyboard clacked in a steady, unbothered rhythm. "His brain is literally running on fumes," Dominic scoffed. "You try telling him to eat a sandwich." Last guy who interrupted his workflow got a fractured jaw. Audrey hit the enter key with a sharp tap. She looked at the silver dome sitting on the edge of her desk. Underneath it was a $30 artisan salad that was currently wilting into compost. She looked at the frosted glass of Gabriel's door. Behind it, she could see his shadow pacing, a dark blur of kinetic, wasted energy. She wasn't scared of Gabriel. She didn't have the luxury of fear. She had spreadsheets to balance, legitimate tax filings to process, and she could not do her job if her boss was operating on the emotional level of a hungry toddler with a handgun. She sighed, opened her desk drawer, and looked at her own lunch. It was leftover meatloaf. Cold, wrapped in tin foil, shoved into a stained plastic container. It was dense, cheap, and entirely unremarkable. Audrey stood up. She grabbed the Tupperware. "Audrey, what are you doing?" Dominic asked, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. He said no interruptions. "The Colombians are calling in 10 minutes. "I am securing my work environment," Audrey said. She didn't knock. She turned the heavy brass handle and pushed the door open. Gabriel stood by the window, his suit jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The ink of a sprawling, dark tattoo peeked out from beneath his left cuff. He held a phone to his ear, his knuckles white. "I don't care if the docks are frozen," Gabriel hissed into the receiver. "Thaw them, or I'll come down there and thaw them with your—" He stopped. He turned slowly, his dark eyes locking onto Audrey. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I will call you back." He hung up. He didn't put the phone down. He dropped it onto the desk with a heavy thud. "I explicitly recall," Gabriel said, his voice dangerously soft, "telling you that I was not to be disturbed until 2. "It's 1:15, Mr. Rossi," Audrey said. She walked across the expansive Persian rug. Her sensible black flats made no sound. She didn't stop until she was standing directly in front of his desk. "And you need to review the Q3 quarterly filings before the legitimate board meets at 3. Leave the file. Get out." "I can't," Audrey said. Gabriel tilted his head. It was a predatory movement, a wolf trying to understand why the sheep wasn't running. "You can't?" "No. Because if I leave the file, you'll look at it, your blood sugar will plummet, you'll find an imaginary error, you'll throw the file at the wall, and I'll have to reprint it. I am out of toner, Mr. Rossi. I refuse to requisition more toner because you refuse to manage your metabolism." For a long, agonizing second, Gabriel just stared at her. His eyes were entirely black in the harsh overhead light. Men had died for speaking to him with a fraction of that insolence. Audrey placed the plastic container on the center of the leather desk mat. She popped the lid. The smell of cold, garlic-heavy meatloaf wafted into the sterile, expensive air of the office. "Eat," she said. Gabriel looked down at the plastic container. It was slightly warped on one side, likely from being left in a microwave too long. Inside sat a square of brown meat, flanked by a sad spoonful of cold mashed potatoes. He looked from the food back up to Audrey, his jaw muscles flexed. "Are you insane, Miss Miller?" "I'm efficient," Audrey corrected. She pulled out the heavy leather guest chair and sat down. She crossed her legs, smoothed her grey pencil skirt, and rested her hands in her lap. "I have 10 pages of tax documents that require your signature. You are currently vibrating with stress. Eat the meatloaf. It has carbs. It will stabilize your insulin. I have a $300 steak sitting outside, which you aren't going to eat because eating a heavy steak requires cutting, chewing, and a knife and fork. It feels like an event." "You don't have time for events," Audrey countered smoothly. "This requires a plastic fork. I brought one." She placed a flimsy white plastic fork next to the Tupperware. Gabriel stared at her. He had built his empire on intimidation. He was a master of reading people, of finding their weak points and applying pressure. He looked at Audrey Miller and found nothing to press. Her pulse wasn't racing. Her hands weren't shaking. She was looking at him with the exact same expression his third-grade teacher used when he failed to turn in his homework. It was utterly disarming. "I don't eat food from plastic containers," Gabriel said, though the venom was draining from his voice, replaced by genuine bewilderment. "It's my mother's recipe. It's dry, but it gets the job done. Eat half. I'll sit here. Once you swallow it, I'll hand you a pen. You sign the documents, and I go away." Gabriel exhaled slowly. The breath rattled in his chest. His head was throbbing, a dull spike of pain right behind his left temple. He was exhausted. He was always exhausted. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out and picked up the plastic fork. He dug it into the cold meatloaf. He lifted a piece to his mouth. He chewed. It was terrible. It was dense, heavily salted, and the potatoes were powdery. It was the most working-class, domestic thing he had put in his mouth in a decade. He swallowed. Audrey nodded, satisfied. She slid the first page of the tax documents across the desk. "Sign on the yellow sticky note." Gabriel picked up his Mont Blanc pen. He signed. He took another bite of the meatloaf. They worked in silence. The only sounds in the room were the scratch of the gold-nibbed pen on heavy stock paper, the quiet hum of the building's HVAC system, and the occasional scrape of plastic against plastic. By the time he reached the 10th page, the meatloaf was gone. Gabriel put the pen down. He leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange, heavy warmth settling in his stomach. The spike behind his eye had dulled. The frantic, buzzing energy that usually lived in his chest had quieted to a low hum. He looked at Audrey. She was neatly gathering the signed papers, tapping the edges against the desk to align them perfectly. "Thank you, Mr. Rossi," she said, standing up. "I'll file these." "Miss Miller." She paused, looking back at him. "Why did you do that?" he asked. The question felt entirely too honest for the room they were in. Audrey held the folders to her chest. "Because, Mr. Rossi, you are a very terrifying man, but you are a remarkably terrible boss when you're hungry. I prefer a boring afternoon over a bloody one." She turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind her. Gabriel sat alone in the quiet office. He looked at the empty Tupperware container sitting on his $10,000 desk. He reached out and touched the warped plastic lid. He didn't yell at anyone for the rest of the day. It didn't become a habit immediately. Gabriel Rossi was a stubborn man, and Audrey Miller was not his mother. For the next 3 days, Gabriel ignored the high-end catered lunches, and Audrey ignored him. On the 4th day, a Thursday, the Colombians finally pushed back on a territory dispute. Gabriel spent the morning screaming over encrypted phone lines. By 12:45 p.m., he had smashed a crystal tumbler against the wall. Audrey walked in at 1:12 p.m. exactly. She carried a dustpan, a broom, and a brown paper bag. She swept up the glass in silence. Gabriel sat in his chair, breathing heavily, watching her. When she finished, she placed the brown bag on the edge of his desk. "Chicken salad," she said. "On wheat. Don't throw this glass at me, it's a rental." Gabriel didn't throw the glass. He opened the bag. By the 3rd week, the silent agreement solidified into routine. At 1:00 p.m. every day, Audrey locked the outer office doors. She forwarded all calls to a secure voicemail. She picked up whatever Tupperware, foil wrap, or paper bag she had brought from home, and she walked into Gabriel's office. The dynamic shifted. At first, Audrey would hand him the food, wait for him to eat, and force him to sign papers. But gradually, the paperwork dwindled. It happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. Audrey brought in half a thermos of beef stew and 2 ceramic mugs. She poured him a mug, poured herself one, and instead of taking the guest chair on the opposite side of the desk, she hesitated. The desk was massive, a physical barricade of dark wood. Gabriel watched her holding the mug. Without a word, he pushed his rolling leather chair back. He stood up, walked around the desk, and leaned against the front of it. He patted the edge of the wood beside him. Audrey blinked, surprised, but she walked over. She hoisted herself up onto the edge of the desk, her feet dangling a few inches off the floor. Gabriel stood beside her, leaning his hips against the wood. close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. They drank their stew in silence. "How much do I pay you?" Gabriel asked suddenly. It was the first non-work-related sentence he had spoken to her in a month. Audrey didn't choke, but she paused. "45,000 a year, Mr. Rossi." Gabriel frowned, staring down at his mug. "That's insulting. It's standard market rate for an executive assistant with my tenure." You aren't a standard assistant. You feed the animals." He took a slow sip. "I launder $3 million a month through a shell company in Delaware. I can double your salary tomorrow." "No," Audrey said quickly. Gabriel turned his head. He was so close, she could see the faint silver scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "No, I offer you 90 grand, and you say no?" "If you double my salary, it looks suspicious to the IRS," Audrey explained, her tone entirely practical. "I file my own taxes. I declare every penny. If my income spikes, they audit me. If they audit me, they look closer at this office. I don't want them looking closer at this office." Gabriel stared at her. He was used to greed. The men he worked with would slit their mothers' throats for a 5% bump in a cut. This woman who brought him homemade stew in a cheap thermos had just rejected a life-changing amount of money to protect his tax front. "You're protecting me," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "I'm protecting my 401k, she corrected, taking another sip of her stew. "And my mother's health insurance. You go to prison. I lose my dental coverage. I have a root canal scheduled for November." Gabriel let out a sound. It was sharp, short, and rough. It took Audrey a second to realize it was a laugh. It was the first time she had ever heard him laugh. It changed his entire face, wiping away the cold, dead-eyed mob boss and revealing the handsome, exhausted man underneath. "A root canal," Gabriel murmured. "God forbid." The proximity changed things. Sitting side by side on the edge of the desk, the power dynamic flattened. He wasn't the ruthless kingpin. She wasn't the underling. They were just two tired people taking a 30-minute recess from a violent world. The danger of his life, however, was always present. It bled into the room a week later. It was a Friday. Audrey had brought leftover baked ziti. They were sitting on the edge of the desk. Gabriel was relaxed, his tie loosened, listening as Audrey complained about the rising cost of subway fares. Suddenly, the heavy oak door burst open. Dominic stood in the doorway, a heavy, silenced pistol gripped in his right hand. He was breathing hard, blood splattered across his cheek. Gabriel was off the desk in a microsecond. The relaxed man vanished. In a blur of motion, he had drawn his own weapon from a shoulder holster Audrey hadn't even realized he was wearing. He shoved Audrey backward, shielding her body behind his own massive frame, his gun trained on the door. "Who?" Gabriel barked, his voice devoid of all humanity. It was the voice of a killer. "Rival crew, the Irish," Dominic panted, keeping his gun low. "They made a play in the lobby. We handled it. 2 down. Front desk is clean, but they got to the catering cart coming up the freight elevator." Gabriel's eyes narrowed. "The food?" "Poisoned," Dominic said grimly. "Cyanide in the soup. They paid off the kitchen prep guy at the restaurant. If you had eaten the delivery today, Gabe." Dominic trailed off, his eyes shifting to the 2 plates of baked ziti sitting on the desk. Audrey stood frozen behind Gabriel, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at the gun in Gabriel's hand. She stared at the blood on Dominic's face. The reality of her workplace, the brutal, fatal reality, crashed down on her. Gabriel slowly lowered his gun. He didn't put it away. He looked back at the desk, at the cheap, slightly stained plastic container of ziti. He turned his head and looked down at Audrey. His dark eyes were burning with a terrifying intensity. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, possessive realization. The expensive food his money bought him had been weaponized. The only safe thing in his entire empire was the cheap, leftover pasta brought by the woman standing behind him. "Clean up the lobby," Gabriel ordered Dominic, never taking his eyes off Audrey. "No police. Call the cleaner, and cancel the restaurant's standing order permanently." "Done," Dominic said, backing out and pulling the door shut. The silence rushed back into the room, thick and heavy. Audrey let out a shaky breath. She looked at the baked ziti. I think I lost my appetite." Gabriel turned fully toward her. He reached out, his hand, calloused and rough, wrapped around her upper arm. His grip was firm, grounding her, pulling her out of the shock. "Sit down, Audrey," he commanded softly. He guided her back to the edge of the desk. He sat down beside her. He picked up his plastic fork, stabbed a piece of ziti, and put it in his mouth. He chewed slowly. "Eat," Gabriel said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate rumble. "We have 20 minutes left of lunch." Audrey looked at him. She looked at the gun resting on his thigh. She looked at the pasta. With a trembling hand, she picked up her fork. The Mafia boss and his secretary finished their lunch in silence, but the air between them had fundamentally changed. It wasn't just about blood sugar anymore. It was about survival and trust. The Monday following the poisoned catering cart, the atmosphere at Rossi Logistics felt less like a corporate headquarters and more like a forward operating base. Audrey stepped off the elevator at 7:55 a.m. She immediately noticed the changes. 2 new men in poorly fitted suits stood by the reception desk. They didn't smile. They didn't offer a polite good morning. Their eyes tracked her hands, her purse, and the heavy canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder. Dominic was waiting by her desk. The bruising on his cheek from Friday's scuffle had darkened into an ugly, mottled purple. "Bag," Dominic said. It wasn't a request. Audrey stopped. She looked at Dominic, then at the 2 new goons, and finally at the frosted glass of Gabriel's office. "Excuse me." "Security protocol," Dominic muttered, looking genuinely apologetic. "Boss's orders. Everything gets checked before it goes past this desk, even yours." Audrey didn't argue. She set her canvas tote on the desk and unzipped it. Dominic didn't rifle through it like a cop tossing a suspect's car. He moved with a careful, almost surgical precision. He pulled out her makeup bag, a paperback novel with a cracked spine, and finally, a large blue plastic container. He held the container up to the light. "What is it today?" "Beef stroganoff," Audrey said flatly. "I used the cheap cuts of chuck roast, so it had to slow cook for 8 hours yesterday." "If you drop it, Dominic, I will staple your tie to the floor." Dominic carefully set the container back into the tote bag. "You're clear. And Audrey?" He paused, rubbing the back of his thick neck. "Thanks for not running out the door on Friday." "My rent didn't magically pay itself over the weekend," Audrey replied. She grabbed her bag. "And I have payroll to submit." She didn't knock when she entered Gabriel's office. He was already at his desk, staring at a bank of monitors that displayed live feeds from the docks. He wore a crisp white shirt, the collar open, the dark shadow of a weekend stubble clinging to his jaw. He looked up the second the door clicked shut. His eyes darted immediately to the canvas bag in her hand, then up to her face. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between them. It was the first time they had been alone since he had pulled a gun and shielded her body with his own. Audrey walked to the side table. She pulled out the plastic container and set it down. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she looked at him, She would remember the cold, dead look in his eyes when he asked Dominic who had breached their floor. She would remember the terrifying realization that her boss wasn't just a tough businessman. He was a killer who operated on a razor's edge of survival. "I brought stroganoff," she said, her voice slightly tight. She focused intensely on booting up her laptop. "It needs to be microwaved. The break room microwave is disgusting, so I requisitioned a small one for the corner of your office. It's arriving at 11. Gabriel watched her. He didn't say a word. He stood up, the leather of his chair squeaking softly in the quiet room. He walked around the massive desk. Audrey froze, her hands hovering over her keyboard as his tall frame filled her peripheral vision. He stopped right beside her. He reached out. For a brief, terrifying second, Audrey thought he was going to touch her. Instead, his large, calloused hand bypassed her shoulder and picked up the blue plastic container. "You came back," Gabriel said. His voice was low, scraping against the quiet air. "It's a Monday, Mr. Rossi. I work here." A man died in the lobby on Friday. Another one bled out in the service elevator. Most people would have emailed their resignation and moved to Ohio. "I don't know anyone in Ohio," Audrey said, forcing herself to look up. Gabriel's eyes were dark, searching her face for a crack, a sign of hidden hysteria. He found nothing but the stubborn, pragmatic set of her jaw. He held her gaze for a long time. The harsh lines of his face softened, just a fraction. "Stroganoff," he murmured, looking down at the container. "With egg noodles," she confirmed. At 1 p.m. the new microwave dinged. The ritual began. But the rules had changed. Audrey didn't wait for him to invite her to the desk. She carried the 2 steaming plates over and hoisted herself onto the edge of the mahogany wood. Gabriel joined her a second later, leaning his hips against the desk, their shoulders brushing. The physical contact wasn't accidental. It was a silent grounding technique. He needed to know she was there. She needed to know he was calm. Gabriel took a bite of the beef. It was tender, rich, and heavily seasoned with paprika. He closed his eyes for a brief second, a subtle exhale escaping his lips. "You didn't eat this weekend," Audrey said quietly. It wasn't a question. Gabriel opened his eyes. He looked at his plate. "I had coffee." "Coffee is a bean water, Gabriel. It is not a macronutrient." It was the first time she had used his first name. The slip hung in the air, heavy and loud, but neither of them corrected it. "I don't trust the food outside this building," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't trust the people who make it, the people who deliver it, or the people who plate it. When you live the way I do, paranoia keeps you breathing." He turned his head to look at her. They were inches apart. "I trust your kitchen, Audrey, and that is a terrifying thing for a man in my position to admit." Audrey swallowed hard. The stroganoff suddenly tasted like ash. She was holding the life of a mafia boss in a cheap plastic container. If she didn't feed him, he wouldn't eat. "Then I guess," Audrey said, her voice shaking slightly before she steadied it, "I'll have to start bringing larger portions." By the 3rd week of November, Audrey was running out of money. Feeding Gabriel Rossi wasn't cheap. He was 6'3" and built like a heavyweight boxer. Her grocery bill had tripled. She was buying double the meat, double the vegetables, and sneaking expensive cheeses into her cart just to ensure he was getting enough calories to stop him from snapping a rival's neck during afternoon meetings. She was at her desk on a Thursday afternoon, staring grimly at her checking account balance on her monitor. She had $32 to her name until payday next week. The door to the inner office opened. Gabriel walked out, shrugging into a heavy, dark wool overcoat. The temperature in Boston had plummeted, bringing a bitter, biting wind off the harbor. "Cancel the 4 o'clock with the union reps," Gabriel said, adjusting his collar. We're leaving. Audrey looked up, startled. Leaving? Where are we going? I have a stack of invoices that need routing. You have a look on your face, Gabriel stated. He stood in front of her desk, looking down at her. The last time you had that look, you spent 3 hours aggressively reorganizing the supply closet because you were stressed. Get your coat, Audrey. I'm perfectly fine, she lied, minimizing the banking tab on her screen. I just need to figure out what to cook for tomorrow. We're out of protein. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. He looked at the minimized tab, then back to her face. He was a man who spent his life reading tells. He saw the slight tightening of her lips, the anxious tap of her index finger against the mouse. Get your coat, he repeated, softer this time. Dominic is bringing the car around. 10 minutes later, Audrey found herself sitting in the back of a bulletproof black SUV. The leather seats were heated, and the windows were tinted so darkly that the afternoon sun looked like twilight. Dominic drove in silence, his eyes constantly scanning the mirrors. Where are we going? Audrey asked again, clutching her purse. Stop and Shop, Gabriel replied, scrolling through something on his phone. Audrey blinked. Excuse me? You said we're out of protein. You need groceries to cook. We are going to buy groceries. Gabriel, I can't go grocery shopping with the head of the Boston Syndicate. He looked up from his phone, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Why not? Am I banned from the produce aisle? You're going to look like a hitman in the cereal aisle. People will stare, and I don't have my list prepared. She didn't want to admit she didn't have the funds to buy anything substantial. I'll handle the list, Gabriel said, leaning back against the leather headrest. When they pulled into the sprawling parking lot of the suburban supermarket, Dominic stayed in the car. Gabriel stepped out, the bitter wind whipping the hem of his dark coat. He walked around to Audrey's side and opened the door, offering his hand. She ignored it, stepping out onto the pavement. This is a terrible idea. It's a domestic necessity, he countered, grabbing a shopping cart. The sight of Gabriel Rossi, a man who ordered beatdowns before breakfast, pushing a red plastic shopping cart with a squeaky right wheel, was deeply surreal. They walked through the sliding glass doors into the harsh, fluorescent glow of the supermarket. Audrey immediately headed for the discount meat section. Gabriel followed, his head on a swivel. He wasn't looking at the prices. He was tracking the exits, the blind corners of the aisles, and the hands of the other shoppers. He walked slightly behind her, and to her left, a human shield in the frozen food section. Audrey picked up a package of ground chuck that was marked down for quick sale. I can make shepherd's pie tomorrow. Gabriel reached out, plucked the plastic-wrapped tray from her hand, and tossed it back into the cooler. Hey, she protested. It's grey, Audrey. I'm not eating grey meat. He bypassed her, walking toward the high-end butcher counter at the back of the store. Give me 4 of the ribeyes, he told the kid behind the counter, whose eyes went wide at the sight of Gabriel's icy stare. And 3 pounds of the fresh ground sirloin, not the pre-packaged garbage. Gabriel, Audrey hissed, pulling at his sleeve. I can't afford that. He looked down at her hand on his coat. He didn't pull away. He looked back up to her face, his expression unreadable. You think I brought you here to make you pay to feed me? I've been paying for it this whole time, and you shouldn't have been, he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, dangerous register that meant he was not to be argued with. You kept me alive for a month on a secretary's salary. I checked the payroll. I know what you make. I know what beef costs. He took the heavy paper-wrapped packages from the butcher and dropped them into the cart. We're buying the good meat. We're buying organic vegetables. We are buying real cheese, not the orange plastic you brought on Tuesday. That was mild cheddar, and it melts perfectly, she muttered defensively. For the next hour, Audrey watched a masterclass in aggressive grocery shopping. Gabriel moved through the aisles with terrifying efficiency. When an older woman blocked the pasta aisle with her cart, Gabriel didn't say "excuse me." He just stood there, radiating an aura of such intense, silent menace that the woman apologized and scurried away. He threw bags of imported coffee into the cart. He grabbed high-end olive oil, fresh bakery bread, and things Audrey couldn't even pronounce. When they finally reached the checkout line, the cart was overflowing. Audrey stood rigidly as the cashier, a teenager named Brenda, scanned the items. Brenda was snapping her gum, completely unaware that the man standing across from her could order the destruction of a city block. The total came to $480. Audrey's stomach dropped. Gabriel didn't blink. He pulled a thick, black leather wallet from his coat pocket and extracted 5 crisp $100 bills. He handed them to Brenda. "Keep the change," he said. As they walked out into the freezing parking lot, the wind cut through Audrey's thin wool coat. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. Gabriel stopped by the trunk of the SUV as Dominic loaded the bags. He looked at Audrey, watching her teeth chatter. Without a word, he stepped close to her. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat, took it off, and draped it over her shoulders. The coat dwarfed her. It was heavy, retaining the heat of his body, and it smelled of cedar, expensive soap, and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder. "I'm fine," she protested weakly, though she immediately pulled the lapels tighter around her neck. "You're freezing," Gabriel said, standing in the bitter wind in just his suit jacket. He reached and adjusted the collar of the coat around her throat. His knuckles brushed against the soft skin of her neck. The touch was electric, entirely at odds with the sterile, freezing asphalt of the grocery store parking lot. "Why are you doing this?" Audrey asked. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual cynical armor. "You're a mob boss. You don't push shopping carts, you don't buy groceries." Gabriel looked down at her. The harsh security lights cast deep shadows over the sharp angles of his face. "Because, Audrey," he said, his voice a low rumble over the howling wind, "you take care of me. It's time I started taking care of you." He opened the door of the SUV and helped her inside. The ride back to the city was silent, but the space between them in the back seat no longer felt like a gap between an employer and an employee. It felt like a tether pulling tight. The end of the fiscal year was a nightmare in legitimate business. In the illegitimate business, it was a waking hell. By mid-December, Audrey was practically living at Rossi Logistics. She had to reconcile the legitimate shipping manifests with the shadow ledgers, ensuring that the dirty money flowing through the ports looked clean enough to satisfy the IRS and the federal regulators. It was a Friday night, 11:30 p.m. The rest of the floor was completely dark. The only illumination came from the glow of Audrey's dual monitors and the amber desk lamp in Gabriel's open office. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Boston was a blurry smear of neon and rain. Audrey rubbed her eyes, a massive headache blooming behind her temples. She had been staring at spreadsheets for 14 hours. She reached blindly for her coffee mug. It was empty. She let out a long, pathetic groan and rested her forehead against the cool surface of her wooden desk. "Don't die on my payroll. The paperwork is extensive." Audrey lifted her head. Gabriel was leaning against the doorframe of his office. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie hours ago. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink covering his forearms. He held 2 steaming ceramic mugs. He walked over and set one down in front of her. "I made coffee," he said. Audrey stared at the mug. "You made coffee? In the break room? The break room that you said smelled like despair and microwave popcorn? I brought my own beans from the grocery run." Gabriel said, leaning his hip against the edge of her desk. It was a reversal of their lunch routine. Now he was the one invading her space, bringing her sustenance. "Drink it. You look like a corpse." "Thank you, Mr. Rossi. You always know exactly what to say to a woman." She took a sip. It was black, scalding, and incredibly strong. It shocked her system back to life. "We're off the clock, Audrey. It's midnight. You can call me Gabriel." Audrey looked up at him. The ambient light of the city threw his profile into sharp relief. He looked exhausted. The heavy burden of running a criminal empire was etched into the deep lines around his mouth and the dark circles under his eyes. "Gabriel, then," she said softly. He didn't move away. He stayed leaning against her desk, looking down at the complex maze of numbers on her screen. "How bad is it? We are $300,000 heavy in the offshore account," she explained, rubbing her temples. "I have to find a way to bleed it into the legitimate equipment repair budget without triggering a flag. It's going to take me another 2 hours." "Stop," Gabriel said. "I can't stop. The board meets on Monday. If this isn't clean, you go to federal prison for tax evasion." Which is ironic, considering everything else you do. Gabriel let out a short, rough laugh. He reached out. His large hand closed over hers, gently but firmly prying her fingers away from the computer mouse. Audrey's breath hitched. His skin was warm and rough with calluses. He didn't let go immediately. He kept his hand over hers, his thumb resting against the pulse point on her wrist. He could feel how fast her heart was beating. "The money can wait until tomorrow," Gabriel said, his voice dropping into that intimate, dangerous register that sent a shiver down her spine. "You are running on fumes. I don't have a choice." "Yes, you do, because I'm making it for you." He finally let go of her hand, walking around her desk to peer into her trash can. It was full of crumpled paper and an empty granola bar wrapper. "When was the last time you ate?" he asked, his tone shifting from gentle to sharp. "I had a granola bar at 4. Gabriel swore softly in Italian. He pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. He didn't wait for a greeting. "Marco, I need a favor," Gabriel barked into the phone. "I don't care if the kitchen is closed. Open it. I need 2 plates of linguine with clams, bread. No, don't send a driver. I'll send Dominic to pick it up. 10 minutes. He hung up and looked at Audrey. "Pack up your things. We're eating in my office." 30 minutes later, the dynamic of the corner office had entirely transformed. The harsh overhead lights were off. The only light came from a single brass lamp on his desk and the city lights bleeding through the rain-streaked windows. Dominic had dropped off 2 massive steaming containers of pasta from Marco's, a highly guarded, mob-affiliated restaurant in the North End, and immediately retreated. They weren't sitting at the desk this time. Gabriel had pulled 2 leather armchairs from the seating area and positioned them by the window, facing the storm. A small glass coffee table held the food. Audrey sat curled in one of the chairs, her shoes kicked off, eating the best pasta she had ever tasted. The garlic and white wine sauce was rich and buttery. She closed her eyes, letting out a small, contented sigh. Gabriel sat in the chair next to her, a plate balanced on his knee. He wasn't eating. He was watching her. "You're staring," Audrey murmured, opening her eyes. "I'm observing a miracle," he replied dryly. "You finally stopped moving." Audrey set her fork down. The quiet of the office, the late hour, and the heavy rain drumming against the glass stripped away the professional boundaries that usually kept her grounded. "Why do you hate eating?" she asked suddenly. The question had been burning in her mind for weeks. Gabriel looked away, staring out at the Boston skyline. The silence stretched for so long that Audrey thought he wasn't going to answer. He set his plate down on the glass table. "When I was 19, Gabriel started, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. My father was the boss. He was a hard man. He had a lot of enemies. One night we were having dinner at a restaurant in the South End. Just me, him, and my older brother, Leo. Audrey stopped chewing. She knew the history of the Rossi family. Everyone in the city knew that Gabriel's father and brother had died violently, pushing Gabriel into the throne before he was ready. But the details were always a street myth. A waiter brought over a bottle of Barolo, compliments of another table, Gabriel continued, his eyes unfocused, fixed on a memory she couldn't see. My father poured it. He toasted. They drank. I didn't. Gabriel turned his head, looking at Audrey. His eyes were entirely black in the dim light. I was a kid. I was hungover from the night before, and the smell of the wine made me sick to my stomach. So I put my glass down. He swallowed, a heavy, visible movement of his throat. It took 3 minutes. Strychnine. It's not a clean death, Audrey. It's a violent, agonizing, suffocating death. I sat across the table and watched the two men I loved most tear their own throats open while I sat there. Perfectly fine, because I was too hungover to drink a glass of wine. Audrey felt a cold horror wash over her. Her heart ached with a sudden, violent intensity. She looked at the man sitting beside her, the terrifying, ruthless kingpin of Boston, and saw the traumatized 19-year-old boy trapped beneath the expensive suits and the gun holsters. Since that night, Gabriel said softly, eating stopped being a necessity. It became a liability. Every plate of food handed to me is a loaded gun. Every drink is a risk. It's easier to just not. Audrey didn't think. She just moved. She uncurled her legs, slid out of the leather armchair, and closed the small distance between them. She sat on the edge of the glass coffee table, directly in front of him. Their knees bumped. Gabriel looked startled, pulling back slightly. Audrey reached out. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hands flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel the heavy, thudding rhythm against her palms. "I'm not a waiter, Gabriel," she said, her voice fierce and unyielding. "I am not a rival crew. I am your grumpy, underpaid accountant who wants you to live long enough to approve my vacation days." Gabriel stared at her, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath her hands. The air between them suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The danger of his world was a physical presence in the room, but the warmth of her hands was an anchor. He reached up, his large hands wrapped around her wrists. He didn't push her away. Instead, he slid his hands up her arms, his thumbs tracing the inside of her elbows until his hands rested on her shoulders. He leaned forward. The distance between them vanished. "You aren't underpaid anymore," he whispered, his face inches from hers. The smell of coffee and rain clung to him. "And you are the only safe thing in my entire world." He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The press of his forehead against hers, the desperate, heavy way he breathed in her scent, was more intimate than anything Audrey had ever experienced. They stayed like that, anchored together in the dark, high above the violent city, while their food grew cold on the table beside them. Monday morning arrived with the subtlety of a car crash. The intimacy of Friday night was a heavy, unspoken thing between them. It lived in the margins of their routine. When Audrey handed Gabriel the weekly routing slips, his fingers lingered against hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. When she brought him his coffee, he didn't just nod. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his dark eyes tracking the tired slope of her shoulders. But the real world did not care about their quiet moments. The real world was currently bleeding all over the Boston docks. The Irish crew, the O'Connor syndicate, had escalated. They weren't just hijacking shipments anymore. They were getting desperate. By Wednesday, Gabriel was operating in a state of hypervigilance. The heavy oak door to his office remained locked. The security detail on their floor doubled. And, to Audrey's profound irritation, she now had a shadow. His name was Paulie. He was 6'2", had a neck like a tree stump, and followed Audrey exactly 4 paces behind, whether she was walking to the photocopier or heading to the women's restroom. "Gabriel, this is absurd," Audrey said, standing in front of his desk on Wednesday afternoon. She had a plastic container of chicken and dumplings resting on her hip. "Paulie asked me for my ID to get into my own cubicle. I've worked here for a year. He knows who I am." Gabriel didn't look up from his laptop. "Paulie is doing his job. The O'Connors are looking for leverage. They know my father's history. They know I don't eat out." He finally stopped typing and met her gaze. "And they know I eat what you bring me." Audrey froze. The container of chicken and dumplings suddenly felt 10 pounds heavier. "Dominic found a drone hovering outside your apartment window last night," Gabriel said, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. It was the voice he used when he was ordering violence. "They are watching you, Audrey, because you are the easiest way to get to me." Audrey swallowed the dry lump in her throat. "I'm just an accountant." "No," Gabriel corrected softly, standing up. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. "You are the woman keeping me alive. That makes you the most valuable asset in this organization, and the most vulnerable." He reached out, taking the plastic container from her hands and setting it on the desk. He didn't step back. He looked down at her, his expression a tight, controlled mask of anxiety. "I'm moving you out of your apartment," he said. "You can't do that. I have a lease. I have a security deposit. I have a cat." "I will buy the building. I will buy the cat a diamond collar." "I don't care, Audrey. You are packing a bag tonight. You're staying in the penthouse." Audrey crossed her arms, her pragmatic streak violently colliding with the surreal danger of her situation. "Gabriel, if I move into your penthouse, it crosses a line. It's not just lunch anymore. I don't even know what it is." Gabriel raised a hand, his rough fingertips brushing against her cheekbone. The touch was agonizingly gentle, entirely at odds with the violent reality pressing in on them. "It stopped being just lunch a long time ago, Audrey," he murmured. "Go home, pack your things. Paulie will drive you to the penthouse at 8. Audrey didn't make it to 8 o'clock. She arrived at her third-floor walk-up in Somerville at 6. Paulie did a sweep of the hallway, checked the locks, and stationed himself outside her front door. "I'll be right here, Miss Miller. Knock if you need anything." Audrey locked the deadbolt. She fed the cat. She pulled a worn duffel bag from her closet and began throwing sweaters into it. Her hands were shaking. The adrenaline that she had managed to suppress at the office was finally catching up to her. She walked into the kitchen to grab her toothbrush from the adjacent bathroom. The fire escape window shattered. It wasn't a movie. There was no slow motion. It was deafening, chaotic, and terrifyingly fast. Glass exploded across the linoleum. 2 men hauled themselves through the broken frame. They wore dark clothes, ski masks, and smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke and wet wool. Audrey screamed, lunging for the front door, but the heavier of the 2 men was faster. He tackled her to the floor. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs. Her head cracked against the lower cabinet. Stars burst across her vision. "Shut up," the man hissed in a thick South Boston brogue. He shoved a heavy, calloused hand over her mouth. "Not a sound, or I put a bullet in your spine." He pressed the cold steel barrel of a Glock against the base of her skull. Audrey stopped fighting. Her heart hammered against her ribs so violently she thought it might break through bone. The second man pulled off his mask. He had a jagged scar across his chin and pale, dead eyes. He walked over to Audrey's refrigerator, opened it, and began pulling out the plastic Tupperware containers stacked on the top shelf. "This is the domestic bliss, huh?" the scarred man mocked, tossing a container of leftover chili onto the counter. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small amber glass vial. Audrey's eyes widened. She thrashed under the heavy hand over her mouth, but the man pinning her pressed his knee into her lower back, pinning her flat against the floor. "Here's how this works, sweetheart," the scarred man said, crouching down so he was eye level with her. "Tomorrow you're going to bring the boss his lunch, just like you always do. But this time, it's going to have a little extra kick." He tapped the glass vial against the linoleum. "If you don't do it, we come back for you. We come back for your mother in her nice little assisted living facility in Brookline. We know where she is. We know her room number." Tears pricked Audrey's eyes. A cold, suffocating terror gripped her chest. They were doing it again. They were turning food, the exact thing Gabriel was terrified of, into a weapon. They were going to make her pull the trigger. I sat across the table and watched the two men I loved most tear their own throats open. Gabriel's voice echoed in her mind. Audrey stared at the amber vial. Then she looked at the heavy cast-iron skillet resting on the stove, just inches from the scarred man's head. She was an accountant. She calculated risk for a living. The risk of poisoning Gabriel was absolute. The risk of fighting back was astronomical. But she had spent the last 2 months feeding the wolf. She wasn't going to let someone else slaughter him. Audrey bit down, hard. She sank her teeth into the fleshy part of the man's palm over her mouth. She tasted copper and salt. The man let out a howl of pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Audrey bucked her hips, throwing the man off balance. She scrambled forward, her fingers wrapping around the handle of the cast-iron skillet. The scarred man lunged for her, raising his gun. She swung the iron pan with every ounce of strength in her body. It connected with the side of the scarred man's head with a sickening crunch. He dropped like a stone, the gun clattering across the floor. "You crazy bitch!" the other man roared, scrambling to his feet, pulling his gun up. Before he could aim, the front door of the apartment exploded inward in a shower of splintered wood. Paulie didn't come in first. Gabriel did. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like death incarnate. His gun was already raised. He didn't hesitate. He didn't shout a warning. He fired twice. The sound in the small kitchen was catastrophic. The man who had pinned Audrey to the floor slammed backward against the cabinets, 2 red blooms expanding rapidly on his chest. He slid down the wood, leaving a thick smear of crimson, and didn't move. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. Audrey sat on the floor, her chest heaving, her hands still gripping the cast-iron skillet. Her kitchen was destroyed. There was blood on her cheap linoleum. Gabriel lowered his gun. He kicked the weapon away from the dead man's hand, then kicked the other gun away from the unconscious scarred man. Only when the room was secure did he drop to his knees. He didn't care about the blood on the floor. He didn't care about his expensive suit. He grabbed Audrey by the shoulders, his hands frantic, searching her face, her neck, her arms for bullet holes. "Are you hit?" Gabriel demanded, his voice entirely shredded. "Audrey, talk to me. Are you hit?" "I'm fine," she gasped, her voice trembling violently. She dropped the skillet. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. She looked at the amber vial which had rolled near the refrigerator. "Gabriel, they had poison. They were going to make me put it in your food." Gabriel looked at the vial. The muscle in his jaw locked. A terrifying, cold fury washed over his face. But when he looked back at Audrey, it vanished, replaced by a desperate, crushing relief. He pulled her into his chest. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He was shaking. The kingpin of Boston, The man who had just executed an assassin without blinking was trembling against her shoulder. "I've got you," Gabriel whispered fiercely into her hair. "I've got you. They are never getting near you again." Audrey closed her eyes, wrapping her arms around his waist, grounding herself in the solid, heavy reality of him. Her kitchen was a war zone, but in his arms, she finally felt safe. "Gabriel," she mumbled against his ruined shirt. "Yeah. My security deposit is definitely gone." Gabriel let out a choked, breathless laugh. He pulled back just enough to look at her, cupping her face in his hands. He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a gentle, romantic kiss. It was desperate, bruising, and tasted like adrenaline and survival. It was a promise. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a glass tower overlooking the harbour. It was massive, silent, and sterile. It had been a week since the apartment attack. The O'Connor syndicate had been systematically dismantled over the course of 3 brutal, sleepless days. Gabriel handled the violence. Audrey handled the silence. She hadn't been back to the office. She was officially on paid administrative leave, though she still spent her mornings remotely balancing the legitimate books from the massive kitchen island in Gabriel's home. It was Friday night, 7 o'clock. Audrey sat at the island, staring at her laptop. She was exhausted. The adrenaline crash from the past week had left her feeling hollow and bruised. She missed her routine. She missed the terrible office coffee. She missed bringing him lunch. The elevator doors opened directly into the living room. Gabriel walked in. He looked exhausted, his tie missing, the top 3 buttons of his shirt undone. But the dark, terrifying edge that had clung to him for the past week was gone. The war was over. He didn't go to his study. He walked straight into the kitchen. He dropped a heavy brown paper bag onto the marble counter. Audrey blinked, closing her laptop. "What is that?" "Groceries," Gabriel said. He took off his suit jacket and draped it over a bar stool. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing his tattooed forearms. "You went to the store. Dominic drove. I shopped." He began pulling items out of the bag. Fresh basil, San Marzano tomatoes, heavy cream, a block of actual Parmesan cheese. Finally, he pulled out a package of fresh, handmade linguine. Audrey watched him, utterly bewildered. "Gabriel, what are you doing?" "I'm making dinner," he stated calmly. He walked over to the stove and turned on a burner under a large pot of water. "You don't cook." "I am Italian, Audrey. Of course I know how to cook. I just haven't done it in 15 years. He picked up a chef's knife and began dicing an onion with terrifying professional speed. "You've spent 2 months keeping me alive on cold meatloaf and microwaved stroganoff. It's time I returned the favor." Audrey sat frozen on the bar stool. For 2 months the dynamic had been clear. He was the boss, she was the caretaker. He provided the paycheck, she provided the survival. But watching him stand in his own kitchen, dicing onions to feed her, the dynamic shattered completely. This wasn't a mafia boss demanding a service. This was a man taking care of his partner. She didn't offer to help. She just watched him. He moved around the kitchen with the same intense focus he applied to his business. But there was a softness to his movements, a quiet, domestic peace that she had never seen in him before. 45 minutes later, he plated the food. He didn't bring it to the kitchen island. He didn't bring it to the coffee table. He carried the 2 steaming bowls of pasta to the massive 10-person formal dining table sitting in the center of the room. It was a table that had clearly never been used. Gabriel set the bowls down. He pulled out a chair for her. Audrey walked over and sat down. Gabriel sat in the chair immediately next to her, rather than at the head of the long table. He placed a fork next to her bowl. Real silver, not plastic. "Eat," Gabriel said softly. Audrey looked at the food. The sauce was rich and red, smelling of garlic and fresh basil. She looked up at Gabriel. He wasn't staring out the window, anticipating an attack. He was looking right at her. His eyes were entirely open, stripped of the paranoia that had haunted him for a decade and a half. The food wasn't a liability anymore. It was just dinner. Audrey picked up her silver fork. She twirled the pasta, lifted it to her mouth, and took a bite. It was perfect. She smiled, a genuine, tired, deeply happy smile. "It's better than the meatloaf." Gabriel leaned over, pressing a kiss to her temple. He picked up his own fork. "Don't push it, Miss Miller," he murmured, his voice a low, warm rumble. "Your meatloaf is still the only reason I didn't shoot the board of directors in October." They ate the rest of their dinner in silence. But it wasn't the heavy, loaded silence of the office, or the terrifying silence of survival. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of two people who had finally found a place to rest. They had built an empire on spreadsheets and violence, but sitting side by side at the dining table, the only thing that mattered was the food on their plates and the person sitting next to them. Audrey thought she was just fixing her boss's blood sugar, but she ended up fixing his broken life and securing her place right beside him at the top of the empire. From surviving a poisoned lunch to fighting off assassins with a cast-iron skillet, this mafia romance proves the way to a ruthless kingpin's heart is definitely through his Tupperware. Did you love this grounded, gritty take on the mob boss trope? Hit that like button, share this story with a friend who loves fierce heroines, and subscribe for more intense, original audio dramas.